The snow fell as if the sky itself were collapsing over the boreal forest. Every gust of wind sliced through the pines like an ancient lament, ripping ice crystals from the air and hurling them against my face. I could barely see 2 meters ahead. The entire world had become a white, shapeless blur, a silence that paradoxically screamed danger. In that moment, I realized I was no longer in control. My name is Lukas Arvidsson, born in Kiruna, northern Sweden, where the tundra meets the forest and winter feels endless. I grew up learning to read tracks in the snow with my father and to respect every breath of wind moving through the pines. For years, I worked at a wildlife rehabilitation sanctuary in the Swedish Arctic, caring for injured foxes, birds of prey, and even rescued wolves. I had always considered myself experienced, perhaps too experienced. That night, I had gone out to monitor trails near the sanctuary, a simple decision that turned into a nightmare. The wind suddenly intensified, visibility dropped to almost zero, and I completely lost my way back. My boots slipped on the ice, my heart raced, and the cold began to bite into my bones. For the first time in my life, I felt that the forest was far greater than me. Then I heard something that froze my blood. Wolves howling in the distance. They were not close, but close enough to remind me that I was not alone. Snow piled up quickly, my hands trembled, and deep regret washed over me. How could I have been so reckless? How could I have trusted my own ability so much? When all seemed lost, something emerged between the snow-covered trees. A red fox appeared silently before me, standing still and staring straight at me. Her eyes reflected the pale light of the night, and for a moment, I felt she understood me better than any human ever could. Without making a sound, she began to walk, and in my desperation, I followed. In the far north of Sweden, where the boreal forest stretches endlessly beneath the Arctic sky, winter is not a season, it is a presence. Snow can erase landmarks in minutes, wind can steal your breath, and darkness can swallow even the most experienced traveler. Out here, nature does not care about confidence, preparation, or pride. It only responds to instinct and respect. My name is Lukas Arvidsson, born in Kiruna, where frozen lakes, silent pine forests, and roaming wildlife shaped my childhood. I grew up tracking animals in fresh snow with my father, learning to listen before I spoke and to watch before I acted. Later, I studied wildlife biology at the University of Umeå and spent years working in a wildlife rehabilitation sanctuary in the Swedish Arctic, caring for injured foxes, owls, and even rescued wolves. I believed I understood this land, perhaps too well, yet one night proved how fragile that belief was. What began as a routine patrol near the sanctuary turned into a fight for survival when a sudden blizzard swallowed the forest. Landmarks disappeared, the wind roared through the trees, and the cold pressed against my body like a living force. In that storm, I was no longer the caretaker of the wild. I was a lost human at its mercy. This is not a story of heroism or adventure. It is a quiet, haunting journey into how quickly the wilderness can humble us. Through howling wind, deep snow, and creeping darkness, I learned that survival depends not on strength, but on humility, patience, and trust in the land itself. Told with immersive blizzard soundscapes and realistic field visuals, this tale invites you to feel the Arctic night, rather than simply watch it. Every step carried risk, every silence carried danger, and every decision mattered. If you love deep emotional wildlife storytelling, subscribe to Silent Wild Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale from the wild. Please leave a like to help this video reach more nature lovers around the world. And tell us in the comments your country and city. We read every message. We read. Now, listen to the wind, feel the cold, and follow me into a night that changed everything. The storm did not arrive, it descended. One moment the forest was silent, the next it was alive with violence. Snow tore through the air in horizontal sheets, driven by a wind that howled like something ancient and furious. The pines bent and creaked, their branches whipping against one another, as if the entire boreal forest was struggling to breathe. I felt small beneath it, a fragile figure swallowed by a world that did not care whether I survived. My boots sank deep into fresh snow with every step, each movement heavier than the last. What had been a familiar patrol trail only minutes before was now a blank, shifting landscape. Landmarks vanished in seconds. Rocks disappeared. Fallen logs vanished. Even the distant silhouette of the sanctuary was erased by white chaos. I stopped, turned slowly, and realized with a cold shock that I no longer knew which way was back. The wind pressed against my chest like a living force, stealing my breath and freezing the moisture on my scarf. Snow piled on my shoulders, my hood, my pack. My hands trembled inside thick gloves, and the cold seeped through every layer of clothing, despite years of experience in this climate. I had faced winter storms before, but this was different. This felt personal. I tried to retrace my steps, scanning the ground for the prints I had left behind. But the blizzard erased them almost instantly. Each gust filled the shallow impressions with fresh snow, turning my path into nothing more than a memory. The forest around me became a maze of identical dark trunks and endless white drift. Panic crept in slowly, like the cold itself. At first, it was just a tightness in my chest. Then it grew. My heartbeat quickened, my thoughts raced, and every shadow seemed to move. I reminded myself of everything I had been taught at Umio, every survival lesson from the sanctuary, every rule of Arctic travel. But knowledge felt thin and distant beneath the storm's roar. Somewhere beyond the trees, the wind carried a sound that made my blood run cold. A long, distant howl. Wolves, not close enough to be seen, but close enough to be real. The forest suddenly felt alive in a different way, as if unseen eyes were watching my every step. I stood frozen, listening, heart pounding in my ears. The snow continued to fall without mercy, clinging to my eyelashes, blurring my vision, muffling every sound except the storm itself. I took another step forward, then stopped again, unsure. Every direction looked the same. Darkness, trees, and an endless wall of white. For the first time in my career, I truly felt lost. Regret struck harder than the cold. I thought of the sanctuary, of the animals I cared for, of how confidently I had left that evening. I had trusted my experience too much, assumed I could read the land no matter the conditions. That arrogance now felt painfully clear and dangerously costly. My breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the icy air, before being torn away by the wind. I planted my trekking pole firmly into the snow and forced myself to slow down. Survival, I knew, depended on patience, not panic. Still, the weight of isolation pressed down on me like another layer of winter. Then, through the swirling storm, something moved. A flash of red against the white, subtle, almost impossible to see. I turned my head just in time to catch a glimpse of a red fox standing still between the dark trunks. She watched me in silence, snow drifting around her like smoke. For a heartbeat, the storm seemed to pause, and and so did I. The wind did not let up. It only grew more vicious. Snow hammered my body from every direction, stinging my skin through layers of fabric. Each breath burned my lungs, icy and shallow. The forest became a living wall of white, shifting and collapsing around me, erasing any sense of depth or direction. I felt as though I were walking inside a storm with no edges. I forced myself to move, planting my trekking pole deep into the snow with every step. My legs trembled from exhaustion, yet stopping felt even more dangerous. If I stood still too long, the cold would creep in like a slow, silent predator. Every movement was heavy, deliberate, and painfully slow. Somewhere beyond the trees, the distant howl came again, longer this time, carrying through the wind like a warning. It echoed across the valley, slipping between the trunks and wrapping around me. I could not see the wolves, but I could feel their presence in the space between the storm's gusts. My heart pounded against my ribs. I scanned the darkness, but the blizzard swallowed everything. Shadows stretched and bent with the wind, making every tree look like a moving shape. I knew the wolves would avoid humans most of the time, but hunger and winter change rules that usually hold. I tried to remember the map in my mind, the curve of the ridge, the frozen stream, the narrow clearing near the sanctuary boundary. But the storm had erased those memories. The land I thought I knew had transformed into something unrecognizable, hostile and disorienting. Then I saw her again, the red fox. This time she was closer, standing perfectly still between two dark pine trunks. Snow drifted around her like smoke, but her eyes remained fixed on me. She did not flee. She did not approach. She simply watched. For a moment, the storm seemed to soften. Not in reality, but in my mind. In that small pocket of awareness, I felt less alone. The fox was not a threat. She felt like a witness, perhaps even something more. Still, I hesitated. Trust in the wild is never simple. She took a single step forward, then stopped again and turned her head toward me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but clear enough. She was inviting me to follow. My instinct screamed caution, yet something deeper inside urged me to move. I took a shaky step toward her, then another. Immediately, she turned and began to walk through the snow with effortless grace, weaving between trees that I could barely see. I followed, heart pounding, lungs burning, eyes locked on the flash of red ahead of me. As I moved, the forest felt slightly different. The wind still roared, the snow still fell, and the wolves still lingered somewhere in the distance. But now I was no longer wandering blindly. For the first time since the storm swallowed me, I had a direction, a guide, and a fragile thread of hope. The storm pressed against me from every side, yet the red fox moved through it as if she belonged to it. Where my boots sank deep into the snow, she glided lightly across the surface, her slender body weaving between dark trunks with effortless grace. I fixed my eyes on the flash of red ahead, afraid that if I lost her even for a moment, I would vanish again into the white void. My breath came in ragged bursts, each one burning my lungs with icy air. The cold crept through my layers despite every preparation I had made for Arctic winters. My legs trembled, my hands shook inside stiff gloves, and still I forced myself to keep moving. Stopping was no longer an option, not with wolves somewhere in the storm. The fox paused every few steps, turning her head just enough for me to see her eyes through the swirling snow. In those brief moments, I felt something unsettling yet undeniable. She was waiting for me, not out of curiosity, but with intention. She knew I was following, and she allowed it. Somewhere beyond the trees, a long howl cut through the wind again. This time it felt closer. The sound rolled across the valley like a warning carved into ice. My heart slammed against my ribs, and for an instant, I almost stopped entirely. The wilderness had its eyes on me, but the fox did not hesitate. She shifted direction smoothly, angling away from the sound before I could even register the movement. It was subtle, instinctive, yet unmistakable. She was steering me, not simply wandering ahead. As I followed, the terrain changed beneath my feet. The deep drifts softened into slightly firmer snow, making each step less punishing. The wind still howled through the pines, but the storm felt marginally less chaotic in this corridor between the trees. It was as if she were guiding me along a hidden pathway I could never have found alone. My thoughts blurred with exhaustion. Memories of the sanctuary flickered through my mind. The warmth of the buildings, the animals I had cared for, the confidence with which I once believed I understood this land. Now, humbled and shivering, I realized how fragile that confidence had been. The fox slowed again near a cluster of dark rocks half buried in snow. She stopped, turned fully toward me, and for a heartbeat, the storm seemed to recede into the background. I felt watched, measured, and strangely trusted. Then she slipped past the rocks and continued forward. I pushed myself to follow, lungs burning, legs aching, heart pounding. The howls sounded once more, but fainter now, as if the wolves had been diverted or kept at bay. Whether by chance or design, the fox's path seemed to pull me farther from that unseen danger. Through the blizzard, I began to sense something I had not felt since the storm began. Direction. Not certainty, not safety, but movement with purpose. Ahead of me, the red fox cut a steady line through the white night, and behind her, I moved with fragile hope, trusting an animal I barely understood to lead me back from the edge of the wild. The storm still ruled the night, but the forest beneath it had begun to change. The air felt heavier, colder, and strangely hollow. Each step I took echoed softly through the snow, as if the ground itself were whispering beneath my feet. Ahead of me, the red fox moved with steady confidence, her slender body cutting a silent path through the white chaos. My breathing came in shallow bursts, frost forming along the rim of my hood and scarf. My legs burned with exhaustion, yet I forced them forward. Stopping was not an option. Not now. Not when the wolves' distant howls still drifted faintly through the wind. Then the texture of the snow shifted beneath my boots. It was no longer deep and soft. It felt brittle, almost glassy. Each step sent a faint vibration through my body. Instinct, sharpened by years in the Arctic, told me something was wrong. The fox slowed. She did not simply pause, she halted completely, turning her head toward me with a deliberate, piercing gaze. Snow swirled around her, but her eyes remained steady. unwavering. It felt less like she was looking at me, and more like she was reading me. I stopped immediately. Beneath the snow, I sensed the danger before I could see it. The faint sheen ahead, barely visible through the blizzard, betrayed the presence of thin ice. A frozen surface covering a hidden stream. One wrong step would have sent me plunging into black, freezing water, my heart hammered violently against my ribs. The cold suddenly felt sharper, more personal. I realized how close I had come to falling, how easily my exhaustion could have ended everything in seconds. In that moment, the forest no longer felt vast. It felt intimate, precise, and unforgiving. The fox took a slow step sideways, skirting the invisible boundary of the ice. She glanced back once more, waiting. I followed her lead, carefully shifting my weight onto firmer snow. My boots crunched softly, grounding me again in something solid. As we moved around the frozen stream, the wind seemed to lose a fraction of its fury. Not much, but enough that I could breathe a little deeper. The howl of the wolves faded into the distance, carried away by the storm. Whether by chance or design, the fox had steered me away from both water and predators. I felt something I had not felt since the storm began. Fragile clarity. Not safety, never that, but awareness. I was no longer blindly stumbling through the night. I was walking with purpose, guided by an animal I barely understood yet trusted completely. Ahead, the red fox resumed her steady pace, weaving between dark trunks that rose like silent sentinels. Behind her, I followed, humbled, trembling, alive, knowing that one misstep could still end everything, yet believing, for the first time, that dawn might actually come. Once we moved beyond the frozen stream, the forest shifted again. The wind no longer struck me head-on, but flowed at my side as if the land itself were reshaping the storm around us. Snow still fell heavily, yet the chaos felt more directional, less suffocating. Ahead, the fox continued without hesitation, carving a narrow path between the trees. My body was reaching its limit. Every step sent pain through my thighs, and my fingers felt stiff even inside insulated gloves. Fatigue blurred the edges of my thoughts. Yet the thin ice behind me had sharpened something inside. A renewed focus born not of pride, but of survival. The wolves howled once more, but the sound came from farther away now, distorted by distance and wind. Whether they had changed direction or the fox had led me away from their territory, I could not know. All I understood was that the forest no longer felt as close to collapsing around me. The red fox slowed near a cluster of dense pines where the branches hung lower, heavy with snow. She slipped beneath them effortlessly. I followed, pushing through the thick needles and sudden darkness. Inside that natural barrier, the wind dropped noticeably. The storm still raged above us. But here, beneath the trees, it softened. For the first time since losing the trail, I could hear my own breathing clearly. The world narrowed to snow, bark, and the small red shape ahead of me. I felt the fragile thread of hope strengthen. Not because I believed I was safe, but because I was no longer wandering without direction. The terrain began to slope gently downward. My boots found firmer ground beneath the snow, and the drifts grew slightly shallower. Through the storm's shifting veil, I glimpsed something darker ahead. A subtle line cutting across the white landscape. As we moved closer, recognition struck me like warmth returning to frozen hands. It was an old hunting trail, barely visible beneath fresh snow, but unmistakable in its shape. I had walked it dozens of times before. It curved toward the valley, and beyond that, toward the sanctuary. I stopped for a moment, disbelief washing over me. The fox stood a few meters ahead, watching silently. Snow gathered along her back and tail, but she remained still, as if waiting for me to understand. The storm roared behind us, yet in that instant, the world felt strangely quiet. When I stepped onto the faint trail, something inside me steadied. I no longer needed to guess my direction. I knew this path. It would lead me through the valley, across the ridge, and back to warmth. I turned to look at the fox, and she had already begun to move away from the trail. She did not follow me further. She slipped between the trees, her red form dissolving into falling snow until only white remained. I stood alone once more in the Arctic night, but no longer lost. Above the storm, the sky was beginning to lighten imperceptibly, the first suggestion of dawn pushing against the darkness. By the time I reached the sanctuary lights in the distance, the storm had begun to fade into a pale Arctic dawn. My body was exhausted, my thoughts slow, but something inside me had shifted permanently. I had spent years believing I understood the wilderness, studying it, working within it, caring for its creatures. Yet that night, standing alone in the snow, I learned a humbling truth. Knowledge does not equal control. In the boreal forest, survival depends not on mastery, but on respect. The red fox never returned to the trail after she left me. There were no final signs, no dramatic farewell. Only wind erasing her tracks as quickly as it erased mine. Perhaps she was simply following her instincts. Perhaps she was never guiding me at all, only moving through her territory as she always had. But I cannot ignore the fact that her path became my path, and that without her, I may not have seen the morning. Since that night, I walked differently in the forest, slower, quieter, more aware of how small I truly am beneath the northern sky. I once believed I was there to care for the wild, but in the storm, lost between wolves and ice, I realized something far greater. I did not save the forest. The forest and a silent red fox saved me.